Hey, everybody. I'm excited to do this fireside chat today. Welcome to the second edition of our webinar series. So I'm Michael Katz. I am the CEO, as well as one of the co-founders here at mParticle. Today, I'm joined by somebody I get the honor of working with every day, our Chief Product Officer, Chee Chew. So Chee describes himself as an introvert. So I'll run through his background very quickly, and then we'll all dive in. So before joining us back in May, Chee was the former Chief Product Officer at Twilio. Prior to that, he was at Amazon as the VP of Consumer Engagement. Before that, he was at Google as the Vice President of Engineering and Site Lead for the Google Seattle and Kirkland offices. And before that, she worked for Microsoft for 14 years. So Bill Gates, Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, Jeff Lawson, and me. I like that. So we're going to talk about competitive dynamics and how competitive dynamics necessitate teams to create and execute a sound data strategy in order to compete for consumer mindshare. So before we get fully into it, we'll do just a little bit of table setting. So let's start with the idea of competitive advantages. So Peter Thiel famously said, competition is for suckers. Unfortunately, for most of us building and running companies, we do have competition. One of the most popular frameworks to understand competitive dynamics is Porter's 5 forces. I'm sure many people here will be familiar with that, but it was first popularized back in 1979, 1980, and obviously a lot has changed since then. But the competitive forces are, again, there's 5 of them. It's intensity of rivalry among existing competition, entry of new competitors, threat from substitutes and complements, bargaining power of buyers, as well as bargaining power of vendors. So as we moved from the industrial age to the information age, we now have to think about how these forces are applied to the digital economy. And so over the course of the past couple of years, with digitization being accelerated, competition now comes from really anywhere and everywhere. And depending on how we view the world, the competition isn't always what others may think of competition. For example, like Netflix has long claimed that their competition is sleep. So it's a battle for mind share. It's a battle for market share, share of wallet, in some cases, time spent awake. So first question I have for Chee. So as somebody that's worked for some of the largest tech companies in the world, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, probably safe to assume you know a thing or two about competitive dynamics. How should people who are looking to drive growth think about the role of competition in the digital economy, and how does that benefit all of us also as consumers?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. And one of the things I've definitely have seen and appreciated from the companies that I work with is competition is something that helps inspire and drive innovation. But like the more important thing is to focus on the value you bring to customers. The advances of cloud infrastructure and the evolution of SaaS services that provide like developer enabling APIs, it has been incredible. Like nowadays, almost every SaaS service you have is starting to put out APIs that allow developers to build on top of it. And it's lowered the barrier to entry for businesses in virtually every vertical. Traditional legacy services and products now have developers, and they use developers as a critical advantage. This means that there's a lot more competition, which means there's a greater importance to innovate on the whole product experience. And this is what I really am super excited about. The growth and innovation has been around the core product. If you think about it, like ride-sharing services and traditional taxis, they both get you from point A to point B, but the convenience, the experience all around getting the ride from point A to point B, that's what's really made modern rideshare services take off. And this sort of innovation around the core product, the experience around the product being the differentiator, is a huge advance and accelerating in the recent years. And I'm so excited about that.
Yeah, it's exciting from a business perspective. It's exciting for, I think, us as consumers. So I think like effectively what you're saying is that the building blocks are now readily available. The stuff that companies used to have to build and invest millions of dollars of capex in are now effectively like they're provided by vendors. Like it's moved to OpEx, right? And so if that is the case, and I think it is, right? Then it really comes down to customer experience, right? Like that becomes the primary form of competitive advantage. Is that fair?
Yeah, I definitely believe that. It's really the experience of the product and the entire interaction with the company around the product. Like consumers more and more will choose a vendor or a business based upon how they're treated. Post-sale, what's the customer support like? What's the follow through? And that's leading business to realize that optimizing that experience is incredibly important, and to make that experience really personal. And what I think a lot of the leading companies have really understood is that, at the end of the day, when you think about the best customer experience, what one customer prefers may be very different than what the next customer prefers. So if you really want to have the best possible experience, there's an adaptive experience that's necessary to understand each customer personally, individually, and personalize it for them. And more, it's also not good enough to have a core set of core screen buckets. It's not good enough to have like 10, 15, 20 buckets to try to personalize just to that bucket. Oh, this is this class cohort of customers. But how can you get down to a point where you're individualizing it down to the individual? Like when I was at Amazon, this was one of the primary things that my team focused on. The vast majority of the products that you buy at Amazon are available at another retailer. My team focused on making it most personally relevant at every step along the way. The notion was like, how can you make every single pixel tuned for the individual? That was the nirvana. Every recommendation from the homepage or the product page or even the receipt, like that was what we wanted to do. And at the end of the day, when you do that, the customer experience wins. And we found that to really resonate with customers.
Yeah. So moving beyond this idea of like these rigid templates or personas, right? Like I think we've all probably seen in like various marketing brochures or whatnot, like the idea of like the soccer mom or the gadget geek, right? Like that to me never really seemed to resonate, and from a practical standpoint also doesn't really scale all that well. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, definitely. And like I remember going through and there's a classification of like high fashion spenders and like people who spend a lot of money on clothes. And then indeed there are people who spend a ton of money on clothes and really high-end clothes. And then there are some of the folks who like spent huge amounts of money on clothes, but they were like really frugal for socks and underwear.
Right.
Like there wasn't that category of like expensive on this and frugal on this. Like it had to come down to an individual. If you could really tune it that way, then you really won.
Right. Yeah, human beings are a lot more dynamic than the standard 15 or 20 personas that people may have you lead to believe.
Yeah.
So I guess like if we carry this forward, CX is the mode, and what that really means is that it's about smart, relevant, adaptive experiences. So experiences that aren't one size fits all or one size or maybe 15 sizes fit all, but are tailored to the individuals based on their first party data. Um, what I guess what brands do you think are doing it right in terms of leveraging their customer data to drive higher quality experiences using personalization these days?
Well, certainly I would look first at brands whose core business is centered around serving up content. The businesses who look back on a large corpus of content, and their job is to really find the right one for the customer at that point in time. And when you think about that, you obviously think about companies like Facebook and TikTok, Netflix, Spotify. They're pulling from a large inventory of content. They're figuring out like who's asking for it, what they want in that moment, and then trying to get the right content to them. Now, when you first think about that, that's like media companies. But when you also think about it, like if you think about modern e-tailers like Amazon, we were in a mindset of also serving up content, like as represented in product pages, but it still was looking at a large corpus of options and presenting it. So those are the ones I think have led the way early on. But the opportunity to understand and personalize, I think, goes from everything from like that sort of online media content, even to like buying cars, real estate, pretty much anywhere I think there's opportunity. If you're looking for an airline flight, like your preferences of what you care about, what you like may differ from mine, almost certainly does. Hotels, almost every business has the opportunity, but the ones that are leading the way definitely to learn from, I think, are really the content companies.
Yeah, agreed. And I think what's fascinating is I think the idea of driving personalization based on your preferences or maybe your explicit behaviors. I mean, it's nothing that's really all that new. I think what interests me and what I find to be fascinating is when you can start to take into account like mobile location data. So you open up an app in one location and it's a totally different experience
Yeah.
than an app in a different place, or kind of the next generation of personalization.
Yeah. So that goes to this notion of personalization is about who you are, but it's also a lot about what your context is right then and there.
Yeah.
That's also personalization. So location matters. And you'll see that even like Google search. If you go to Google and you search for like a restaurant that opens right now, you'll get restaurant recommendations that are local to you. And so that location is really important. One of the things that we also found at Amazon was when you were doing a search, the context of what you had been looking for in the past 30 minutes impacts how you're thinking.
Mhm.
Even if like you were searching for a book and now you're searching for like electronics, what happened in the recent past impacts what you're doing right now. So the current context is really, really important as well.
Right. Yeah. So context has moved beyond, earlier days of kind of mainstream web usage. Context kind of referred to content and what you were consuming. Now it's about the world around you and potentially even like who you're with. So it feels like there's this kind of explosion of data. You've gone almost from like 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions now that you have like this geospatial component. How, I guess, like, how do teams need to start thinking about tackling the data challenges to get it into a good kind of usable state?
Yeah, that's really one of the big challenges right now. Like, how do you get it into that usable state? And one of the things that um, I think about is really thinking forward of what do you want your data infrastructure to look like in 3, 4, 5 years? What would it look like when your company is twice, 3 times the size it is today? And the reason I think about that and encourage that sort of thinking is because at any point in time, let's say let's start thinking about the marketer, for example. They're trying to do a personalized campaign. At any point in time, they may say, I wish I had access to X data. I wish I had access to spend data or age information or address or pick one. But the most expedient thing at that time might be to go and plumb a line from the data repository in whatever system has it into the marketing system. And you may do that one time. And then you do another one, and you do another one. And then now a customer support team has a similar request. So you plumb one incrementally, one line by one line. And then you end up with this like spaghetti of mess. So the real question is, what should it look like? When you have double the number of departments, when you've onboarded more SaaS services as your company grows, how do you want the data to flow? How accessible do you want it? Start from that notion and then work backwards into what is the expedient thing to do today to make sure that you are able to tap into the data that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up some great points, which I think are kind of near and dear to some of our core beliefs. I think one of the popular misconceptions about the customer data platform space is that it's primarily, or depending on who you talk to, exclusively a marketing tool, right? So I guess, like, why is that? And maybe I think help people better understand, like, how should they be thinking about the role of the customer data platform within the organization?
Yeah, look, having this customer data and the CDP and all these tools focus on marketing, like that's kind of the obvious first step. And I think that stemmed from the fact that it was the most clearly and immediately measurable impact came in marketing. When you paid for a marketing slot and it doesn't convert, you immediately know that you've kind of tossed money. But when it does convert, then you know that you kind of made money. And so it was like immediately measurable. When you make some investments in personalization on something content in your service, you may not see the payoff from a revenue point of view for a while, and so it's a little bit indirect. Going back to marketing, even like before the internet existed, marketers like really understood the value of targeting, of personalization. When they were like literally buying bulk mail to send through US mail and they were paying for postage, like they couldn't send mailing to every single person, and they knew a lot of it was going to be like going straight from the mailbox to the trash. So they knew they had to personalize in order to make their dollars extend. They were hungry for consumer data decades and decades ago. And then when the internet came, then the progressive marketers just jumped at the opportunity to get that data, to utilize data and optimize the business. So that's kind of what led us to marketing as the first stop. But more and more, you're seeing businesses realize that the opportunity is way beyond marketing. We talked about like content serving business earlier, social media. They like live and die on personalization. They live and die on the ability to mine the customer data. But let's also look at the customer service department as another example. In legacy companies, the contact center historically is like a pure cost center. And the name of the game was to squeeze that puppy down, to like count the seconds that an agent is on the phone and reduce the number of seconds, minutes that people were talking to customers. At Amazon, we realized that it was actually one of the earlier barriers of entry for customers, like to move from physical shopping where you had a store you could drive to return a product, complain, or anything like that. Like, what happens if you go and you buy it and you get shipped to you and you don't like it? How easy or hard is it to return? I don't know if you or folks listening, how many of you have like done a return at Amazon? I think that if you have, the most likely thing is that once you did it the first time, your reaction was, wow, that was actually not so bad. That was pretty easy. And then if you like pay attention to what you did, the odds are your willingness to shop went up, and your loyalty went up, and your spend went up. Amazon, we built an internal CDP where we validated that. We actually quantified the impact over the next year. And then we facilitated this mindset shift for customer service, not to be a pure cost center that you squeeze down, but how does it become a loyalty tool that helps grow the business? Like, this is the power of taking the CDP and customer data beyond marketing and integrate it into the rest of the business.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. It seems like maybe some of that thinking is kind of rooted in maybe legacy approaches where marketing was really the only means of addressability, and marketing was viewed as a profit center, whereas other things were viewed as cost centers.
It is. No, I will say that we talk about it as legacy, but the reality is the vast majority of companies, if you look at all the business of the world, the majority of companies still think that way. And so I think the opportunity right now for like folks who are really thinking and starting to understand customer data is to actually be part of the lead pack. Like, some companies are migrating beyond that, but there's a lot of opportunity because the world really is primarily focused on marketing for the customer data so far.
Right. But as we were talking about before, customer experience in its totality is not about any one single touch point. It's not just about personalized content or product recommendations. It's not just about marketing. It's not just about customer support. It's not just about, say, building ML models. It's about all of that, and what is the kind of sum total of that customer experience, the consistency, the quality, right? So I guess one question is, like, as you think about that, the data does need to be managed holistically, right? But you have all of these different individual needs of that customer data, different teams wanting to do different things with it, maybe connected to different tools with different specs. Like, how should people think about that that process where you have this kind of convergent, divergent set of requirements?
Yeah, so this is a definite change that I've seen over the past like 10, 20 years. That the problem is interesting, new, and different today than it was, like, say, 20 years ago. And I think a lot of this comes from just cloud computing and the innovation that has happened. If you think about what consumer data and infrastructure was 20 years ago, there were a lot more like big suites of software where a company would buy one suite and it would like handle like everything, and that one suite may have a single corpus of customer data that everything pulled from. So there was a true idea of a single source of truth. But with cloud computing, you have all this innovation where companies are building these amazing specialized tools. And so you have like a specialized tool for marketing automation. You have one for like ticketing. You have one for an aspect of your customer service. You have your sales opportunities. Like, you have all these specific tools, and each of them have their own data representation of the customer. And it's a partial representation. And so you have data that's kind of scattered everywhere. And each department in the company, like, they're focused on like succeeding. So they're like gathering their customers, they're using their tools, and they're generating customer data, and it's trapped in their silo and it's in their schema. And so that's the challenge. And like the thing that I think that companies who really succeed at is they look at the whole pie, and they look at like, how can we corral all the data? How do we get that data from all the different aspects? It's kind of like fracking. How do you really pull squeeze the juice out of every corner and get into a place where you can really use it? that's what I think is really important and challenging. And I think that the important thing is to first start recognize that challenge, recognize that that's going to proliferate. It's a natural evolution of the world that we're in, and then devise a strategy for how you want to corral that. Right?
Is that, I mean, in your view, is that one of the things that makes customer data so challenging? And maybe as a follow-up to that, like what are some of the common traps that you see teams falling into?
Yeah, that definitely is one of the things that makes customer data really challenging, uh, uh, because it is scattered throughout the system. Another thing is like each department is collecting just the data they need. And consumers, when you ask them questions, like they answer quickly. They don't always answer consistently. Sometimes they share accounts. So you might be asking a question like, what is your age? And there's actually one person's logged in, and then a couple days later, you ask that from another point and you get a different age. And they were actually two people behind one account. And so the data is inconsistent. Um, and also with the modern world of people's sensitivity about their privacy, the data can be dangerous if you don't treat it well. So there are lots of factors of today's world that make data really challenging. And you layer on top of that, our ability to collect data has just grown immensely. That you can like movement track, you can page track, before someone's logged in. So like they're initially anonymous, they may convert. As you're collecting huge volumes of data, our world could not handle this volume of customer data 20 years ago. So the complexity is coming from all around. And the aggregation of all that, I think, is what really makes the whole thing daunting. But that's what tools like CDPs are made for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I know our customers get the most benefit out of is in helping them craft a data strategy and being really deliberate. Just because you can collect a certain amount of data doesn't mean you should, right? There's a lot of noise, right? And there are lots of tools. There's a lot of bad advice out there that says like it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, or it's like, hey, just drop this tag and we'll collect everything and then you can kind of parse through it. It obviously creates a bunch of noise. It also creates a ton of cost. The thing that we see as like the longer term impact is like it doesn't actually force you to be really intentional about creating a data strategy, right? So in making that leap, how do you think about moving from thinking about customer data as like this afterthought that you can just kind of like parse through all the noise, or rummage through the hay to find the needle, and transforming it into something that ultimately is more of a strategic asset?
Yeah, it is a hard question, and like as you said, you can collect a massive amount of data, and if you simply blindly do that, then you're just growing the hay pile from which you're trying to find the subset that you really care about and utilize. So, like I think one of the most important thing is to really define, categorize the information that you want, understand it, normalize it, and then make it available to your teams. In terms of like how do you do that, what I would say first of all is it's important to recognize that it's never too late to start, and it's natural that companies start off without having a great data strategy, and then you grow, and then you collect more, and at some point you realize that you have a lot of opportunity to mine, but you do have this sort of like disorganized mess of data. That's kind of natural. But although it's never too late to start, the longer you wait, the more silos there will be. So I definitely believe that, as soon as you recognize the opportunity, like go at it. conceptualize what you want the data infrastructure to look like when your company is 2-3 times the size it is today. How do you want the data to flow? One of the things I've seen in businesses that have marketing drive this is they come and they say, the marketing says, I need certain bits of data from departments A, B, and C. And then because time is crunched and their martech team like really wants to satisfy as quickly as possible, they take and they plumb direct lines from marketing, from the departments A, B, and C to marketing. And that works well enough for now. And then department C comes along and says, oh, I want data from departments A and B. And so the most expedient thing is to plumb direct lines from that. And as I said earlier, that creates a bit of a mess, but also creates this other thing that I've seen that's been really painful for a lot of companies, is at some point, you may be dissatisfied with one of the services and you may want to change. A new innovation has happened and you want to transform and move to another service. But now that service has many lines of data dependent upon it and dependent upon its existing schema. And so you're kind of stuck with that service. And so you have to make this horrible Sophie's choice of, do you make this big investment to replumb all the lines, or do you live with a suboptimal service? And that's a terrible choice to have. So I think when most companies really sit down and think about that, they understand that having a central system, more of a hub and spoke model, is the way that will really give them the greatest agility, give them great governance, and then allow them to move forward into the future and really scale and grow with the company. So thinking that through, thinking what you want things to look like when your company is 3 times the size it is today, and then work backwards from that.
Yeah. And I like what you said about kind of creating that hub and spoke strategy, because it's also about having a system that's purpose built to do this. I think one of the things that we obviously see in market is almost a sunk cost fallacy applied to their marketing tech stack. It's like, well, I've already invested in an analytics tool or a marketing automation tool or an attribution solution or whatever it may be. And since the data is already in there and I know it's going to be tough to get something like this rolled out, maybe I just kind of like route data through that tool. But those tools were meant to be like destination systems, not source systems. Like that's what they were purpose built to do. So the misapplication of applications as infrastructure may like put a little bit of a band-aid on the problem, but it's not an actual solution, right?
Yeah, so it's a little bit nuanced, but like if you talk to your great engineers who, like many times, like a software system starts with that end user application, and then you look at, oh, there's a bunch of infrastructure that we would love to take advantage of. Do you build out from that application and sort of tack on infrastructure, or do you really step back and say, what is the architectural approach? What is the right thing? What is the infrastructure that should sit behind it? Like good engineers will say, look, at the end of the day, you will be happiest if you actually look at it from an infrastructure point of view and see what it takes to enable the application, as opposed to say, the application kind of almost does it. How do we just extend that to be infrastructure for us? Like, you'll get a job done for now, but you'll pay an ongoing price, and you'll learn that it was too expensive in the long run.
Yeah. And that cost that you end up paying, I think, is the cost of ultimately not being deliberate and intentional, by effectively not having a coherent data strategy. So you're constantly in this hyper reactive mode where I need this tool, I need to respond to this thing, I have this pain or problem that I need to solve for. versus looking at like, well, how do I build the structural capacity? How do I start with the right information, the right data to power my information system, which can ultimately power my communication system and eventually like my strategy and tactics and whatever tools I use to deliver upon those. I guess like that mindset shift though, in your view, I guess why can't more like what's preventing more companies from getting there sooner or faster?
Like as I said before, a lot of times you're so busy and you have like these quarter targets or like short-term goals, and the question is like, what do you do now? Do you make this trade-off of like, I can do the expedient thing now, or I can make a step back a little bit and look at like, how do I mine and improve the system for a longer term period of time? This is one of the things that I really learned and appreciated from how Google and Amazon both have worked in terms of saying, look, it's really important to think about the fundamentals of the business and the fundamentals in the technology side of the business. And when you make the investment in having great infrastructure, it not only solves your problem, but also spawns huge new opportunities. The agility of Amazon to like pop up new ideas, new products, I think a part of that has come from the separation of infrastructure that they made from the application layer and to really value it. Fundamentally, that's how AWS came about. And I think that's really, really important. But the thing that often holds people back is in the short term, you look at the unorganized mess of data that you have, and you're concerned that it's just too daunting. It appears a bigger problem than potentially actually it really is. And so you take the most expedient path.
Yeah. It's probably a conflation of like what's urgent versus what's important. Yeah. And there's an like the kind of old saying is like it's not important until it's important, or like it's not a problem until it's a problem, right? Along those lines, I think that there's a ton of value that can be created by the customer data platform as it relates to going out and playing offense, right? Creating better customer experience, driving better personalization. Flip side of that is also protecting against privacy, right? So not sacrificing defense while you go out and play offense. So with the shift in consumer sentiment around privacy, all of the regulation, and the changes that have been enforced by Apple and soon to be Google around privacy, like what role should the CDP play in terms of helping teams future-proof their business and safeguard themselves from unnecessary risk?
I think that the role can be played, it can be big for the CDP, but let's step back a little bit and say, like, when I talk to businesses about like how do they deal with their privacy policy, and how they enforce it, unfortunately, there are quite a number of companies who work by establishing a policy and trying to push that policy out through education. And the way that they enforce that policy is by auditing. And like that's a very weak way of deploying and enforcing a policy. And that's how when you have mistakes happen, like there was a privacy violation in one department somewhere, like that reflects on the entire company. You're only as good as your weakest link. But a lot of times that happens, those mistake happens because like it was sort of open for human error. Because the policies were just education for individuals. And there wasn't a proactive mechanism to enforce policy. So any great IT CIO or CISO will tell you that if you really want and care about these policies, if these are critical for your company, and I think that safeguarding customer data is critical to people's companies, then it can't just be education. It actually has to be technology enforced. And in order to do that, you have to have some central management system. That's what like CIO tools are all about. Like, how do you centralize, manage the policies, the information policies for the company, and then proliferate that through all the systems. Customer data is no different than that. And the role that a good CDP really needs to play is a place where you can establish what the consumer data policies are, like collect that, and then enforce that, and make it so that people down the line, all well-meaning, won't accidentally make mistakes with it and violate policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So that proliferation and enforcement ultimately requires deep integration of those controls, rather than, I think what you're saying is like, rather than have it be maybe a scan that happens after the fact, right? After the violation has occurred, you want to prevent the issue, not scan for the next, not just scan for the next issue.
Right. Otherwise, you're just cleaning up. Like,
Yeah.
you want to be in cleanup mode, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. So you don't, similar to, I think, one of the earlier points around getting leverage from a tool like a CDP that was purpose built to integrate customer data into other systems, versus maybe taking like an application first approach and then using whatever connectors have been built or webhooks to move data around. That never really gets you completely off the hamster wheel, right? You have to think about, yeah, the leverage.
It doesn't. And that's from a protection point of view. And then the thing that I love about a great CDP is not only protection, but also creates opportunity. Like, like sometimes tools like are either opportunities or they're protection. And, like you make a hard trade-off of like, where do you want to spend the money, defensive, offense? But customer data has the opportunity for both. It can be dangerous. There's also this massive gold mine, right?
Right. Yeah. So you have marketing, you have analytics, you have customer support, you have compliance, you have data engineering, right? But so where does the data strategy reside, and like who should own the data strategy? Because like when everybody owns it, nobody owns it, right?
Yeah, and there are lots of different approaches for this. I've seen it owned by CIO. I've seen it owned by like a chief digital or chief data officer. Sometimes if there's a like marketing, engineering, and martech team, like they may own it, especially initially when it's driven by marketing. There are pros and cons for each. I don't know that like I would. I don't know that I would push a big change in that ownership unless like really the company is feeling the a pain around that. What I would more emphasize is think about this as any huge asset and risk of the company. If you have another like huge opportunity asset of the company, you take care of it. You make sure that it's not a side hobby, it's not a night and weekend job for someone, but you actually like have someone that you trust really own it. I think that's the most important thing. Like, recognize it as a huge opportunity, recognize it as a risk, staff it with someone you trust to lead it, and fund the team, the resources around it to really get the most out of it. I think at the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, we've for the past few years have championed this idea of like data as a team sport, but effectively, like there needs to be a captain of
Yes.
the team, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, makes sense. So we've talked about the importance of data quality. We've talked about matters of privacy and governance, and obviously the need for a system that was purpose built to easily integrate data into the downstream applications. So say organizations get to a good state, they implement a CDP like mParticle, we start streamlining their data flows and protecting data quality and making sure that they're not violating any legislation. Like what's next? Like what should this be the setup for?
Well, that's the super exciting, like extracting the value out of it's the data science, the analytics, making predictive and prescriptive analytics to understand how to shape the business. That's the huge opportunity. Perhaps a great topic for a future session. But for now, what I leave you with is sort of disclosing the dirty, frustrating secret that a lot of the data scientists of the world have realized. These data scientists, great data scientists, they get excited and they learn and they get hired for building these great models to take advantage of the data. They're told, we have a massive amount of data, you can really like go wild and build incredible things. And then when they join your company and there isn't this data strategy, what they end up doing is they spend months and months and months like getting to the data, getting like the privacy teams permission that say they're allowed to use the data in this certain way, checking whether the terms of use agreement with the consumer allows them to use the data in that way, negotiating with each department, can I get access to this data? Will you let me have it? Getting it all together, collecting it, reconciling it, fixing conflicts, cleaning and organizing data literally takes months and months and months. And then only after you do all of that, then can you actually start building models. And that's super expensive to pay data scientists to really be cleaning the data. That's not what you want them to be doing. You want them to really be building. And like the what's next is to build, to innovate, and being thoughtful and planful around the data is what accelerates that build.
Yeah, because especially within the context of a customer data platform, I think the idea of like garbage in, garbage out resonates fairly well. Like I think it's a kind of relatively straightforward concept, but I think what people don't necessarily understand is like when your job is to then connect data to a dozen or a couple dozen downstream systems, and then you're also getting data back from those systems. If the data is bad and then it's being distributed and decisioned on, and then you're getting that return path, then that derivative data is also bad. So things can spiral out of control really fast if you're not building the necessary foundation for long-term success.
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the dangers of big data. When it's small data, when you're looking at a few things, like it's easier to spot and say, there's something wrong here, it doesn't smell right. And then so you can analyze it, you can figure out what it is, debug it, and then it's done. The challenge with big data is that you can sometimes say, oh, well, there's so much data here that like it's got to be right. But if there was an error, as you said, downstream, and there were like subsequent data that is built upon it, like that data actually could be wrong, even though you have a lot of it. You just have a lot of wrong data.
Right.
But you can be convinced because of how many data points you have that you got to believe it. And so getting it right up front is so important.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. So let's wrap with that. I think that's a critically important point. Lindy, thank you for moderating. I want to bring you back in and be able to surface any questions that have been asked by the audience.
Great, thank you both. So we got a couple questions that came in. One of them I'll give as a softball to you, Chee. What is your advice for someone who wants to grow up to be Chee Chew, AKA a product leader?
Huh. That's a tougher one than all of these questions
My
about data.
softballs.
Yeah. I tell you, for me, this simple thing for me is I follow where I'm having fun, where I feel I can make a big impact, and where the people, the company around me likes the type of impact I'm having. So I'm super passionate about personalizing experiences, about building great experiences for customers, for consumers. I love doing that, and I just kind of follow where it's fun to work. I think that's the important thing for anyone to do.
Agreed. That's a great answer. Okay, here's another one. What's your advice for dealing with a decade of data tech debt?
Yeah, I've seen this a lot. The top thing is, at some level, don't think about it as a decade of tech debt or anything. Just you've got a lot to work with, and figure out where you want to be, and then figure out how you take the incremental first steps. If you believe, like, for example, in a hub and spoke model, which I believe strongly for a CDP, in a hub and spoke model for this, don't worry about cleaning up all 10 years worth of data coming from every place. Just start with the most valuable 2, 3, 4, 5 sources. Maybe it's just 2 sources. Just start there. Get a win there, and then add on another one. I'll tell you what happened at Amazon was we built a CDP. We didn't call it a CDP, but we built essentially a CDP inside, and it served initially just the marketing use case. And then another team came along and said, "Oh, we like your engine. We would like to use it in this other way." And then our response was, "Oh, hey, great. You need this other additional piece of information in there. So you've got to plumb that one thing in, and then you can use the whole system." And so they gave one more data source. And then our marketing team took advantage of that one additional data source, and they did better. And then another team came along and said, "Oh, wow, you have a bunch of information. We're really interested in that." And then they would start using it, and they would bring in like 1 or 2 more pieces of data. And then everybody else benefited. And the corpus, the power of the engine, grew one leg at a time. And so you may have a mountain of debt, but just start with getting value out of a subset in the direction that you want things to end up in 3 to 5 years.
Great answer. All right, I'll hand you one more question. We have a few more that I'll just send over and we can respond afterwards. If other folks have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll make sure that we'll just send you a note afterwards and you can connect with folks. But for the last one, this person says, at our company, we've built a lot of our own data sources and integrations, but now we're realizing we may actually want a CDP. What is your advice for me being an agent of change?
Unfortunately, we've seen that story before. And what I would encourage is, initially, don't worry about trying to convince everyone to convert over. One of the good things about, if you've built your own CDP and you have a bunch of things plumbed in, you can bring in a CDP like mParticle and sit right beside it and start just bringing, like, have your CDP be an input source for ours for now. We have custom APIs, you can bring it in, and then you can plumb that out, and incrementally you can replace. So the important thing is to just get started. It doesn't have to be big. I'm a big believer in, don't try to convince everyone by words, but just do it. See the results, see the improvement, and then go from there.
Yeah, I would also add, I think, like what you're probably feeling is that people have this view that like the CDP is really just about a limited set of capabilities where data comes in, maybe you do some segmentation and then you ship the data off. The challenge, one of the challenges with the opportunity is the maintenance of API changes, right? So whether it's new vendors or existing vendors who I think like, you know, the vast majority of our partner ecosystem updates their APIs multiple times a year. I think it's on average about like 6 API changes per year per partner, right? So as you start adding more, you're also signing up to maintain more. And you get to a point where then that just becomes so overwhelming in terms of resource allocation, where you know, the total cost of ownership for these things, as inclusive of that being the opportunity cost of not being able to do other things, just dramatically outweighs usually the hard cost of partnering with a company like us.
Yeah, like and a lot of the companies that are evaluating us, they're almost always also evaluating like building themselves. And we've seen this story before where they decide to build themselves, and then like a couple years later, they come back and say, okay, it wasn't what we thought it would be. Because a lot of companies, when they look at it, they think about what it takes to build what they need right now. And they don't realize that data is changing, that, as you said, the destinations keep changing their APIs, they add capabilities, they change their schemas, and you've got to keep up with that. The laws change around the world, you got to keep up with that. And the needs change, and different departments change the SaaS tools that they want to use. And so it's not a one and done, it's an ongoing investment, and that gets super expensive.
Great, thank you both. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us today. This session was recorded and we will send it out to you shortly. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out and we're happy to connect you with folks. Thank you both.